field trials. But I don't think it's too early to anticipate the possibility of a situation arising in which suddenly there is a great deal more fear than there currently is, coming much more rapidly than the scientists anticipate, clicking in. And at that point, we could have a real mess on our hands if there are no rules whatsoever. So what I'm saying is anticipate the need for having a basic principle, which is thou shalt not mess with the atmosphere unless everybody agrees in some globally representative way. And the criteria for judging this have to do with meeting a very heavy burden of proof. You have to demonstrate that the benefit to be achieved decisively outweighs the negative consequence. And I would say, and this is the important point, you have to demonstrate that this is not a substitute for mitigation. Because if it is, it's the equivalent of heroin addiction, basically. Once you start, you can't stop. And that you have not affected the underlying carbon buildup, so it is acidification in the oceans and all that is keep going.
You might explain why you can't stop.
Suggest
why you can't stop. You cannot stop because the technique that will work only works for a year or two. You put particles up, they come down within a year or two. The carbon dioxide stays for a century. So his bathtub analogy is...
But the bathtub has continued to fill, so if you stop, suddenly you get a whopping big temperature increase, which just raises ecosystems.
And we're messing around with the rate of temperature increase. I think it's fair to say we're projecting a rate of increase that the geological record has never seen. So we're messing around already with global balances that could conceivably put everyone at risk. And if you want the nightmare scenario that might wake everybody up and suddenly make this a much bigger deal than it has been, it's the possibility of a surging release of frozen methane, gas hydrates, that would produce a positive feedback cycle. And, you know, that could create an image of real catastrophe. I mean, real catastrophe that would seize everybody's imagination, way out in front of what the scientists could really sort out. And that's been hypothetical. I've been saying this for about a year since we've been talking about it, and people have been saying, yeah, but it's, you know. But they've just measured it in the Arctic shelf. It's the first observation, but I would say we ought to pay attention to that because this is a potentially very big deal. Bottom line of all this is we need to start talking about it in terms of the governance issues. What kind of rules do we need to put in place to provide adequate vetting for any initiative? And unfortunately, it's not just big governments that could do this. It is small governments. It is billionaires probably could figure out, I'm going to save the world all by myself, and I won't bother to mention it. So you've got a situation in which small initiatives could have a global effect, and we don't have any rules for dealing with that, and I'm saying it's time to start talking about the rules. I concede that on this subject and in general, it's not popular to talk about global rules. So I'm telling you, however, we're looking at situations that's going to make it necessary, like it or not, and we ought to start thinking about it, please.
Can you mention what bodies you might have in mind? You mentioned an informal set of bodies through national academies of science that could work on these. Are there other bodies you think that would be well suited that you can imagine to take this responsibility? Or
well, you can imagine the coordinating mechanisms of the National Academy of Sciences working out some kind of understanding among them. And making themselves kind of maybe the global equivalent of an institutional review board for medical practice. You know, if you do any experiment on human beings, you have to justify yourself to institutional review boards to do it independent, that you're not subjecting the subjects to unnecessary risk. I think they could, using that analogy, they could set up a basic mechanism and understanding on the way Granger's talking. Okay, if you're operating within these fairly narrow or limits where we don't think there's going to be any major global consequence. Do it on your own, or you can do it on your own, but there are disclosure rules, transparency rules. You've got to publish what you're doing. You can't hide it. If you go beyond these limits, and the limits need some agreement, then there has to be, I would say, some common vetting process that they would have to organize among themselves collectively. We all have a stake in that. And I would say it's good to start talking about just that much. But what happens if tomorrow we get sort of somebody announce, okay, we've got frozen gas hydrates coming out like crazy, and unless we stop this, we're all dead. And people start believing that. What do we do? At that point, if you're talking about real emergency things, I'm saying, well, if you're looking at the only mechanism we have at the moment for global vetting, you're talking about the UN Security Council. You're going to have to go through that. And if you don't like that, then think of something else, because don't think that you can do this on your own without triggering real reaction. And this is something that if people think they're going to get excited about, they're going to get really excited about, and you're not going to be able to act unilaterally. Say,
a couple more comments on sort of coordination and who might do what. As I mentioned, the Royal Society has done a study that, among other things, introduced this very useful distinction between solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. The Royal Society is getting geared up right now to do a second round of work on global governance issues. It'll be an informal kind of thing. In the paper that John and I and our co-authors published in Foreign Affairs, we also raised the prospect that ICSU, the International Council on Scientific Unions, might be a candidate for coordinating at least research activities among different research groups around the world. I want to reiterate what John said, which is I think that any research in this area needs to be open. I think it would be truly disastrous if we discovered a few years from now that there was a black program that some government had stood up to sort of learn on the quiet how to do this. I also think that we do need to get a serious research program going, because the sorts of events that John's talking about, that is a climate catastrophe of one sort or another, are still way out in the tails of the probability distributions of our uncertainty. I don't think there are very many scientists who would say they're high probability events, but they are out there. There is some, it's not zero. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be in the position of suddenly deciding you got to do something dramatic quickly if you haven't studied it and you don't know what might happen.
Right. Just one little bit. The burden of proof on the moment, quite appropriately, falls very heavily on anybody who wants to proclaim a catastrophe. You have to demonstrate to confidence that it will shift in public a lot sooner than it'll shift among the scientists. And if it did, if some image of a catastrophe started to take hold, it would be very difficult to disprove it also. When you're dealing with out on the tail, low probability events, whoever carries the burden of proof to say it might happen loses. And so what you have to worry about is some image of catastrophe that seizes broad imagination, and the scientific community cannot disprove it. And you could get that. This frozen gas hydrate thing has some potential in that regard.
So you started the session by saying many people look at this and think it's a really awful idea. And I agree. And I think that's actually a good thing that many people look at this and think it's an awful idea. Messing with the planet is not something one should do lightly. And actually, it was very interesting. The Russian participant at this workshop we ran in Portugal reminded us about various Russian attempts to, redirect rivers and otherwise engineer the landscape, and pointed out that there was a lot of hubris here and it didn't work out too well. you don't want to. So if you do as a